This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Probability thinking does. When we live anticipating the probabilities, we don't open ourselves up to the truth that nothing is impossible with God. This idea that nothing is impossible with God is, for most people, not really a belief, it's a wish. And so we kind of live our lives thinking, well, I wish nothing was impossible with God. And I know that, as Christians, we're supposed to believe that, but man, I really have a hard time really holding on to that. And it becomes more of a wish than a real belief. The truth is, most of us think that way. We look at our circumstances and we think and plan for what we consider to be the most probable thing that will happen. And then we tend to define God by our circumstances and the probabilities of what we think will happen. In other words, we put God in a box that has been designed by our past. But you see, God thinks in possibilities. God doesn't think in probabilities. God doesn't base his thinking on your past. He thinks in possibilities. He's not limited by your circumstances. We already saw Sarah's barren state where she couldn't have children, and God said that he was going to fulfill his plan to give Abraham a son, but Sarah's circumstances was such that she couldn't have a child. The Israelites, we just mentioned them a little while ago, when they finally left Egypt, when Pharaoh pushed them out, and then after they left, Pharaoh changed his mind, decided he would chase them down, and pinned them between the sea and the Egyptian army. Now the Egyptian army was armed. They were not. And so there they were, stuck between the sea and the army, and what did God do? He basically opened up the sea for them so they could escape. Now if God can cause a 90-year-old woman who was barren to get pregnant, and he could open up the sea as an escape route for the Israelites. And oh, by the way, when the Egyptians chased them through, then he brought the sea crashing in on the Egyptians. If God can do that, don't you think that he can overcome the circumstances in your life to overcome his plan for your life? He's not limited by your circumstances, nor is he limited by your unbelief. You say, yeah, but I just don't have enough faith. I don't have enough belief. You see, even if you have trouble believing that God can do something that incredible for you, that doesn't limit God. God's not limited by your unbelief. It didn't matter that Sarah didn't or couldn't believe it. Remember that she laughed when God said that she was going to be pregnant? She had trouble getting her head around it. And God said, no, I don't need you to believe it. I just need to put it on the calendar. And he did. It didn't matter that the Israelites were fearing for their lives and thought that they were going to perish there against the sea. That didn't matter. That didn't stop God. He wasn't limited by their unbelief. He is not limited by your unbelief. Now, he may choose, because of your unbelief, not to act. The Bible does give us that. But sometimes, and really a lot of the times, in fact, maybe it's half and half. I don't know, maybe it's the majority. I'm not sure. But God isn't limited by your belief. I love the story in the Bible of the father who comes to Jesus and he says, my son has seizures, would you heal him? And then he says, and these are his exact words, he says, if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. And Jesus' response is in Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 23, and he says, if you can do anything, if you can, did I just hear you say if you can? It wasn't that Jesus was mocking him, Jesus was pointing at something, and he said, look, everything is possible for him who believes. And what he was saying was, look, maybe you don't believe, but I do. So everything is possible. I know, not if I can. The truth of the matter is, I can. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, well, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. What he was saying is, I believe. In other words, he wouldn't have even asked him to do something if he didn't believe that maybe he could do something. So there was some belief there, maybe a little bit, but mostly wishing. And Jesus healed him. He wasn't limited by the father's unbelief. That didn't stop God. Romans 3, verse 3 and part of verse 4 says, what if some did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. God isn't limited by your unbelief. God isn't limited by the requirements of your circumstances. You might say, well, yeah, but, my situation, I got all these things. It's just, God's got to do this and this and this and this. God's not limited by the requirements of your circumstances. Again, referring back to Abraham and Sarah's situation, wanting to get pregnant. Sarah was too old. Abraham wondered if he wasn't too old. But God doesn't think in probabilities. God thinks in possibilities, and He thinks that every impossibility is a possibility. In fact, God defines impossibility as a possibility. We're the ones that came up with the idea that an impossibility is negative. God says impossibility, possibility, all the same to me. It's all a possibility. Your impossibilities are God's possibilities. In fact, I'll even turn it around even one step further. All of God's possibilities, all of the things that are so impossible, are God's probabilities. God says, yep, that's impossible. I think I'll do it. That's how God thinks about you, by the way. He's not limited by the probabilities or the impossibilities, and He doesn't want you to think that way either. He doesn't want you to limit your life by what you consider to be the impossible or the probable. Now, don't get possibility thinking confused with positive thinking. Probability thinking dwells on the past. I've mentioned that already. I've kind of defined it that way. It's the past and the present, and we define the present based on the past. Probability thinking says, this is the way it's been, this is the way it is, this is the way it's always going to be. This is what's going to happen. Positive thinking is an attitude that focuses on the things that you want to happen. And for years, there was this whole positive thing. I mean, there are books written about positive thinking. And it's this idea that if you really want it and you really focus on it, that you can make things that you want happen. If you can dream it, you can achieve it, that type of thing. But possibility thinking is focused on what God wants to do. Not what you want to do, but what God wants to do.
Looking for a Bible study that's focused on the practical application of the Bible? Check out our website at theopenclass.com.
By your blood, and it's only through your